9. SS Mahino. The SS Mahino was built during the early 20th century, and the 400-foot-long vessel originally operated as a luxury ocean liner in the Tasman Sea, transporting passengers between New Zealand and Australia. It had first, second, and third-class accommodations and a carrying capacity of 420 passengers, who all had access to a dining room, smoking room, and a music room with a grand piano. The Mahino was converted into a hospital ship for servicing injured military members shortly after World War I broke out in 1914. It had 8 wards, 2 operating theaters, 5 doctors, and a full staff of nurses and army medics. The 5,000-ton steel-hulled steamer ferried wounded soldiers to and from various places throughout war-torn Europe, Egypt, and New Zealand. After the war ended in 1918, it was turned back into a passenger ship and returned to commercial service. In 1935, the Mahino was decommissioned and sold to a Japanese shipbreaking yard. Just a few days into its final voyage from Sydney to Osaka, the vessel's tow line broke during a cyclone. Crew members failed to reattach the line, and the ship began to drift. It washed ashore at Fraser Island, and the 8-man crew set up camp while they waited to be rescued. Help finally came a few days later, and while the crew members survived, the Mahino was left in rough shape. After several failed attempts to refloat it, it was left sitting along the shoreline. It was listed for sale, but nobody bought it, and what's left of the rusting hulk remains at the site to this day. It's since become an iconic part of the landscape, but it'll eventually deteriorate and disappear, and visitors are banned from going onto the wreck for safety reasons. 8. The Seabound. One of the first ships to wreck at Fraser Island was a wooden schooner called the Seabound. She departed from Rockhampton for her home port of Sydney on April 2, 1857, but never arrived at her destination. The ship's fate was a mystery, but rumors began to circulate about a white woman and her 2 children living in an Aboriginal village on Fraser Island. 2 years after the wreck in 1859, authorities commissioned local shipowner William Harry Sawyer to search for the alleged survivors. Apparently, the Seabound had wrecked on the notorious Breaksea Spit sandbar. The captain, crew, and passengers traveled in lifeboats to Fraser Island, where they were met by Aborigines who allegedly killed all the men but spared the women and children. Acting on tips from locals, Sawyer and his crew discovered 2 fair-skinned girls living in an Aboriginal community along the island's coast. Assuming that the girls were survivors of the shipwreck and that their mother had died, Sawyer took them to Sydney. The ship's records later revealed that there was a little boy and a girl on the Seabound, but not 2 sisters. The girls may have been albino Aborigines who were mistaken for being white, or they could have been biracial. But it soon became obvious that they were members of the community they were taken from, and their stories took a sad turn after they were forcibly relocated to Sydney. Unfortunately, one of the girls died in an institution shortly after arriving, and the other died 20 years later from consumption. It's now believed that everyone traveling aboard the Seabound died at sea. 7. Stirling Castle. The Stirling Castle was built in New Brunswick, Canada in 1829. It initially travelled from Scotland to Sydney under John Donmore Lang, a Presbyterian minister, writer, and historian. He was also one of the first advocates for an independent Australian nation. Along with him came the founders of the Sydney Mechanics School of Arts, including members of what would become one of early Australia's most prominent families, the Petrys. In 1836, the Stirling Castle left Sydney for Singapore under the command of Captain James Fraser. However, it didn't get very far before it struck a reef and ran aground off Queensland. The ship came to rest on Great Sandy Island, which is known today as Fraser Island. James Fraser, his pregnant wife Eliza, and the rest of the vessel's crew camped out on the beach while attempting to repair the Stirling Castle. Eliza ended up giving birth, but unfortunately her baby didn't survive. A few days after the wreck, the group was taken in by the local Butchulla people. Fraser died in their custody, but historical accounts contain conflicting claims about the man's cause of death. Some say he starved, while others contend that the Aborigines killed him. Eliza and 3 other survivors were rescued 7 weeks later by Royal Navy Lieutenant Charles Otter. Upon her return to England, Eliza shared the story of her ordeal and quickly became a celebrity. Her fame inspired the renaming of Great Sandy Island, and by the 1880s it was widely known as Fraser Island instead. Modern historians suspect that Eliza's accounts of her experience were exaggerated, and that these stories helped fuel hostility toward Aborigines. According to some survivors' narratives, the group was treated well by the Butchulla people, who went out of their way to ensure their health and safety. 6. Waiwera. There's no definitive count of how many ships have wrecked off Fraser Island, but there were at least 23 recorded wrecks between 1856 and 1935. One of them was a schooner called the Waiwera, which wrecked off the coast of the island in 1905. Few details are available about the ship itself. According to an article in The Argus, a former newspaper based out of Melbourne, the ship was on its way to central Queensland, where it was scheduled to pick up some timber and water along the Burnett River. The Waiwera was manned by a captain named D. Thompson, his 10-year-old son, also named D. Thompson, first mate C.M. Scott, and 10 Aboriginal crew members. During the trip, the ship encountered what the article described as very heavy and dirty weather. It was driven into heavy breaker waves despite the captain's best efforts to turn the ship around. The captain and his son, the first mate, and 11 others boarded one lifeboat, while 5 crew members boarded a smaller vessel. They had no time to grab food, water, or any other provisions before getting into the boats. In the meantime, the Waiwera sank and everything on it was lost. The survivors eventually decided to beach their boats at Waddy Point on the eastern side of Fraser Island. From there, they began the 25-mile walk to the nearest lighthouse. 5. SS Aramac. Built in Glasgow, Scotland in 1889, the steel steamship SS Aramac operated as a passenger and cargo ship under the Australian United Steam Navigation Company, making regular runs between Melbourne and Cooktown. The first major incident involving the ship happened during the Maritime Union strike in 1893. With the regular crew members on strike, the Aramac was manned by a non-union scab crew. While sailing near the entrance to Moreton Bay, someone rigged the forecabin with dynamite and set off an explosion in the middle of the night. The prime suspect was Australian revolutionary Larry Petrie, who at the time was travelling under the name George Frederick Howard. He was a known radical socialist, and he appeared on deck suspiciously quick after the blast to let everyone else know that he was in his cabin when it happened. Luckily, nobody was seriously injured and the Aramac avoided major damage. Petrie was charged with attempted murder, but he maintained his innocence and was ultimately absolved of any blame. In 1904, the Aramac crashed hard against the Breaksea Spit, a sandbar notorious for its shipwrecks. To avoid alarming the passengers, the crew initially acted like nothing was wrong. The vessel continued on for another 15 miles before the crew realized they could no longer conceal the emergency because of how bad it was leaking. Passengers were then loaded up onto lifeboats and took refuge on nearby Fraser Island. The Aramac was initially anchored off the coast of the island, but it was later towed to Brisbane for repairs. If you were on a sinking ship with no lifeboats, what would your instincts tell you to do? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 4. The Panama. The American sailing vessel known as the Panama arrived at Keppel Bay off central Queensland in February 1865 to drop off 150 coal miners who were on their way to the Peakstown mine. About a week later, the ship departed for Newcastle. Along the way, it repeatedly encountered strong winds and then a cyclone, which blew the vessel toward Fraser Island. The Panama struck the infamous Breaksea Spit and was beached at Rooney's Point near the northwest side of the island. 2 crew members tried swimming to shore, but only one of them made it to land with their lives. During low tide, the captain, several crew members, and the ship's passengers managed to reach the shore. The survivors later claimed that Aborigines came and took their belongings while they camped on the beach, prompting the captain, 4 crew members, and 1 passenger to flee in a lifeboat. They were picked up by a passing steamer and were returned to the wreck, where 1 crew member was rescued. Sadly, 3 passengers and 8 crew members lost their lives when they tried to escape in another boat. After visiting the wreck, timber entrepreneur William Pettigrew described it in his journal as being nearly all to pieces and said it was burnt. He also wrote that he took some dry wood for firewood, but that most of the ship was too wet to salvage. 3. SS Chang Chao. The British-built SS Chang Chao left Sydney for Hong Kong with a cargo of coal in 1884, with 119 passengers and 70 crew members aboard. Shortly into the journey, the 269-foot-long ship struck Sandy Cape Shoal off the northern tip of Fraser Island. It was refloated at high tide, but the hull was severely damaged, and the vessel was taking on water faster than the pumps could remove it. In a bid to save the lives of everyone on board, the captain beached the ship on the eastern shore of Fraser Island, just 5.5 miles south of Sandy Point. 7 Chinese passengers drowned when their lifeboat capsized in a swell, but everyone else was rescued. During the 1980s, Bruce McCullough and fellow diver Neil Black explored the Chang Chao wreck. McCullough collected some artifacts from the site and called a designated hotline to report his findings. He ultimately decided he didn't trust the state authorities to handle them with the respect he felt they deserved. Later, he told the Courier Mail that he got the impression they would put the items in boxes and forget about them. McCullough held on to the artifacts for 30 years until his son convinced him to negotiate handing them over to the government. An agreement was eventually made to put the items on display at the Maryborough Bonstall Museum, and McCullough relinquished his collection. Fraser Coast councillor George Seymour said the artifacts were especially appreciated because they help tell the story of the Chang Chao, which is little known despite its significant role in Queensland's history. 2. MV Natone. The MV Natone's lengthy history began in 1919 when it was built in Norway as a fishing vessel called the MS Fainfjord. Over the years, the ship went by many names. It was called the MV Wyatt Earp from 1932 to 1939, while sailing under the command of the famed American explorer Lincoln Ellsworth. Between then and 1947, the ship served as an ammunition carrier for the Royal Australian Navy under the name HMAS Wongala. The vessel was then refitted for Antarctic voyages and was recommissioned as the HMAS Wyatt Earp. During its first trip to Antarctica, the ship encountered numerous problems and was deemed unfit for future voyages to the icy continent. During its final years, it served as a cattle carrier called the MV Natone. While sailing from Cairns to Brisbane in 1959, the ship encountered a cyclone and ran aground on some rocks at Rainbow Beach, a small tourist town in Queensland that's considered to be Fraser Island's southern gateway. Miraculously, everyone survived and made it to the beach, with some crew members riding on hatch covers as huge waves carried them to shore. In the end, the Natone was deemed unsalvageable and was left in place, where it broke up on the rocks. 1. SS Marlou. The SS Marlou was a steel steamer that was built in England in 1891, and she operated as an Italian luxury liner early on in her career. In 1895, the ship was sold to the Adelaide Steamship Company, which used it as a merchant vessel. While traveling from Mackay, Australia to Brisbane in 1914, the ship struck a submerged reef in calm waters off northern Fraser Island. The Marlou took on water fast, so the captain deliberately beached it on Fraser Island shore. Thanks to his quick thinking, the entire crew and all 38 passengers were rescued, although he was later blamed for failing to exercise due caution while navigating in an area with known hazards. Green tomatoes and bottles of whiskey littered the nearby beach, but most of the vessel's cargo was salvaged. Attempts to refloat the ship were abandoned during rough weather, and the Marlou broke apart and sank. Tides and erosion occasionally reveal what's left of the wreck, which sits about 1,000 feet off Orchid Beach in 30 feet of water. If you owned your own private island, what would you name it? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye!